So a few weeks ago, a popular YouTuber removed the DPF and disabled the EGR. More interestingly, they had a reputable shop do it, and then they posted it on YouTube. Welcome back to Jebry's Gibberish. So a popular YouTuber in Australia removed their DPF and disabled their EGR, and the whole internet has gone crazy. Now, I wasn't going to enter into this debate, I was just going to let it slide. And I saw a couple of weeks ago that Ronny Dahl did a video on this exact subject, and I thought he made some really good points. But I think he left some important points out, and that's why I'm making this video. So you're probably wondering why a popular YouTuber removing their DPF and disabling their EGR makes me want to put the title "Is the Diesel Dead?" on my video. Well, that's because I'm going to delve into something a little bit more complicated than just removing your DPF. And we're going to talk about why people want to do that in the first place. And I know Ronny Dahl talked about this a little bit, but he left out some really important parts. So Ronny talked about the fact that if you've got a V8 Land Cruiser, having a DPF mutes the sound of the V8. And, well, I agree with him there. And I have a V8 Land Cruiser and I got a pre-DPF model and it sounds great. I love it. I'm just a little child deep inside. And that, to me, is something that I love about the car. If you own a four-cylinder diesel, you probably aren't that concerned about the exhaust being muffled by a DPF. And, well, if you are, then having a DPF is doing everybody else a favour. Otherwise, it sounds like you're driving a wet fart. Ronny also touched on grass fires, which, yes, I agree, but probably a bit of a stretch. I mean, if you are working in dry grass all of the time, perhaps if you're a farmer and you're in dry paddocks all of the time in the summer, then that might be a concern. But diesels have got catalytic converters that get fairly warm nowadays anyway. Admittedly, they're not quite as big, but don't think that's the reason why the majority of people who remove their DPF want them gone. Ronny also talked about performance upgrades, and if you're running a stock engine, you are going to see very little, if any, difference from removing your DPF as far as performance goes. If you were going to put a high-end tune in and try and make lots of power, then the DPF could potentially become a restriction, but there are alternatives. You can get larger DPFs to go with a larger exhaust. So that is not necessarily a reason to get rid of a DPF, although it would cost you a fair bit of coin to buy a new DPF in a different size. But the one thing that Ronny didn't talk about, which I really was quite surprised about, I thought that that would come up, is reliability. Now, yes, some people have DPFs and some people do hundreds of thousands of kilometers without any problems. There are lots of trucks out there that have DPFs that have very few problems. But there's also a lot of trucks that do have problems, and there's a lot of four-wheel drives that do have problems. Just look at Toyota. There's a class action against them for this exact issue, for having DPF issues. I've got a friend who's just had a DPF issue on a Nissan. So those problems do exist, and it's one of the reasons why people want to get rid of them. And in fact, that was the reason why this particular YouTuber removed it. Yes, he was doing a tune, so maybe it was partly because of that, but the DPF had partially melted and wasn't any good anymore. Now, I'm not endorsing removing your DPF, but what I did find really interesting was that all of the criticism that I read, or at least most of it, on pages like Cowboy Turned on Facebook or Instagram, with comments in the videos, both on the video that was posted originally and on Ronny's video, these comments are mainly negative about publicizing the removal of the DPF. And there was very few that were actually upset about the removal of the DPF itself. There was also no mention of the EGR in Ronny's video, and I thought that was really interesting too, because I think the EGR is potentially more of an issue than the DPF in some instances. So EGR problems have plagued cars for decades because EGRs aren't new. Electronically controlled EGRs are a little newer, the last 20 years or so, but they have been around for quite some time before that. So EGR stands for exhaust gas recirculation, and it's just another environmental system to try and reduce emissions from vehicles. They're very popular on diesels, but they have been used on petrols too. So what all of these emission systems, your DPFs, your diesel particulate filters, and your EGRs, your exhaust gas recirculation, and then other changes like having lower tolerances in your oil control piston rings to try and reduce the amount of friction in the engine to try and improve fuel efficiency means that we have a perfect storm in modern common rail diesel engines. We have these super high pressure injection systems with super high temperatures running exhaust gas through back into the engine, and then we have high breathing engines because of the piston control rings, like in the 1VD motors. They breathe very heavily, so we're getting a lot of oil, we're getting a lot of carbon and a lot of heat from the exhaust gases. We're mixing it all together, and then we're just jamming the hell out of these modern engines. And that's before we even start talking about DPFs and the problems involved there. Now, you can obviously rectify this problem by removing the intake and cleaning it out on a regular basis, but that's actually a really labor-intensive job. If you do it yourself, it's going to take you most of the day, if not more. And if you pay someone else to do it, it's going to cost a lot of money. There are chemical ways to do it. I don't know much about those, how effective they are, but I imagine they're not cheap either. So I thought it was really interesting that Ronny didn't actually talk about the EGR. And I wonder if that's because, I don't know, maybe he thinks that it's a good idea to disable. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he didn't want to get into that debate. But it is interesting because the EGR is probably more of a problem than the DPF in that it's causing engines to gum up. So I think a lot of people got upset about this because, well, one, it was probably not a very smart thing to do with the fines that you can cop for removing DPFs and disabling EGRs. But I think the other thing that I saw as a common theme, people being upset, was the fact that it was bringing the full drive community into disrepute, I guess. But lots of people do it. A lot of the common comments were, yeah, that's fine, disable the EGR or bypass the DPF or whatever, just don't tell anyone. And, well, I don't know what difference that makes really at the end of the day. But it does bring up an interesting argument, especially regarding the EGR. They're quite easy to disable on a 1VD engine. And if you do, are you making it better in the long term for the environment by producing more emissions in the short term? Or are you just being an environmental vandal? Let me know what you think about EGRs. EGRs, yes or no? So by reducing these emissions in these modern cars, are we actually reducing our overall emissions? It's the same argument when it comes to the electric cars and the older diesel cars. A TD42 that was made in 1989 is probably still running. The body would have rusted away before the engine stopped working. Even a small modern car or a modern turbo diesel, is it really going to be running 30 and 40 years in the future? Or are we going to have to scrap it because it started to run like rubbish and we can't afford to fix it? On top of that, once they get to 100,000 kilometres or miles and the intakes start to clog and things start to not work properly, are they really running as good as they should be? Are those emission control systems now making it run worse? Are they making it pollute more by running richer and making more smoke and not burning off correctly? Or is it negligible? Because I would be really interested to see a pre-DPF Land Cruiser, for example, and a post-DPF Land Cruiser. I'd like to see one that doesn't have an EGR and one that does have an EGR. Let's put 200,000 or 300,000 Ks on them because that's what we do in Australia before we sell them. And let's just do an emissions test on both of those vehicles at that point. Let's see which one's running better. Look, I'm not a scientist and I'm making this purely based upon my own opinion, but I just imagine that the graph of a new common rail diesel versus an old diesel like a TD42 might go something a little bit like this. We'd probably start off with the modern diesel producing way less emissions. And as it gets older, it's probably going to start creating more emissions, and depending upon how well it's been maintained, it might even spike and start creating a whole bunch more emissions because it's probably clocking up the intake. There might be failures with some of the electronics. And all of a sudden it's running like snot and it's producing a heap of black smoke and it's not burning its fuel efficiently. Now, the old motor starts off running pretty poorly because let's face it, they did. And it's got like a linear kind of lifespan across its emissions. It just kind of keeps running the same for hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Maybe you have to put a new injector pump in it or some new injectors, which are pretty cheap compared to modern alternatives at some point, maybe 250, 300,000 Ks. But then she just keeps rolling on. Now, what's going to happen with this modern car is it going to break down? Is it going to become too expensive to fix? When you need to put a new set of injectors and it costs $8,000 and a new fuel pump at $10,000, is it worth it? Is the car going to be financially worth repairing? Or are people just going to keep driving it until it completely dies and causing a whole bunch more emissions? And then once that car does get thrown on the scrap heap because it's just not financially viable to fix it anymore, we have to build a new car. Now, that's great for capitalism. That's great for a consumerist economy. It's great for big companies. But is it great for us and is it great for the environment? Well, I personally don't think so. Now, maybe this is a bit of an exaggeration. I don't know. I'm really interested to see what you think about this. But what I see happening right now is these diesels are not being reliable for the long term like an old school diesel was. And that's where that whole "is the diesel dead" comes to mind, because we look at cars like the Y62 running a 5.6 litre naturally aspirated petrol engine, and there have been YouTube videos, I'll put a link below, where people have done tests with these things and actually got better mileage towing a big van up a mountain with the petrol than they were with the diesel. The diesel's got a smaller, over a litre smaller displacement, and it's got 2 turbos, and it just should be winning. It should absolutely kill a 5.6 litre petrol V8, and it's not. Because technology in petrol engines has come a really long way, and diesels are no longer simpler than petrols. They're more complicated than petrols. They're more expensive to fix. There's more things to go wrong. And it's not like you can't buy petrol when you drive out bush in Australia. Unleaded fuel is everywhere in one way or a form. It really is. I used to have a petrol 4B and it wasn't a problem. So do we really need to keep pushing on with diesel engines? I don't know. I really like them. But do I like them because of what they used to be? Or do I like them because of what they are now? And that's something I haven't quite decided on just yet. I think in the very near future, we're going to see the same sort of progress towards engine development in, say, Land Cruisers and Prados as what we've seen in the RAV4. We're going to see hybrids, just like the Prius and the Camry and the RAV4. We're going to see either a V6 or a 4-cylinder petrol engine and a hybrid arrangement. Is that a good thing? I actually don't know. I don't particularly like the idea of hybrids myself, and that's a whole nother issue, but I think that's probably what's going to happen. It's going to be forced upon us. And I can't see them putting a diesel engine in a hybrid. Maybe they will. Maybe they would do that for the Australian market, but I just don't think they would. And even if they did, I don't think that would be a great solution because it wouldn't offer any real benefits. So this is a really interesting topic, and I actually don't know what the answer is. I'd love to hear your opinion on this. Do you think the diesel engine has seen its day? Do you think it's got a couple of years left and then it's just out? Or do you think that we're going to push on in Australia with a diesel engine? And if so, why? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching.